All the accounts of Jesus' resurrection in all four Gospels are fabulous. We can't get enough of reading them and just being astounded at the wonderful truths that they speak to us. And yet, if I was pressed for perhaps one particular incident or even one verse, and yet it comes down to one word that's my favourite, I think it would have to be here in John chapter 20. It's verse 16. The whole scene is that the disciples, some of them, and the women have gone to the tomb. They're distraught because it's empty. Mary Magdalene, she stays there looking around the tomb, looking around the garden. She bumps into someone. She's no idea it's Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener, and she pleads with him. She says, do you know where they've laid the body of my Lord? Where have they taken it? And then in verse 16, Jesus just says this one word to her, Mary. He calls her by her name, and she understands and sees immediately who it is, and her heart is melted, and she responds in verse 21 like this. She turned to him and cried out, Rabboni, which in Aramaic means teacher. How precious a moment that must have been, where she realized that her Lord and Savior wasn't dead, but he was alive. And there he was in the flesh, standing in front of her. More than that, calling her by her name. That's what Jesus does to every single one of us when he calls us to himself, when we become Christians. That's what happened to me when I was a teenager. Jesus called me by my name. He drew me to himself, and he opened my eyes to see my need of him and how precious a Saviour he was then and still is today. We get a wonderful verse that speaks about how personally God is with his people. It's a promise that was written centuries before Jesus came, a promise written by the prophet Isaiah. He writes this in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 16. This is God speaking about his people, how important they are to him. I have engraved you, God says, on the palms of my hands. Our names are written on his hands. Of course, Jesus had his hands outstretched for us. There on the cross, carrying and bearing our sin. And he calls us each individually by name because he loves us in ways that we can only but dream and can't properly grasp. And yet we must believe and hold on to and know how precious his love is for us and his care that's complete and for all eternity.